The Birth of Fascism by David Alafondes Siqueiros. Now, this painting, The Birth of Fascism, has been, kind of gnawing at my mind for a long time. Mostly because when I tried to look into it, I tried to look, what is it really about? What is the explanation for this painting? Is there anything that really explains it? Maybe someone wrote a thesis or just an idea, a paragraph on what it's about. And nothing. I looked throughout the internet, couldn't find anything. If anyone finds anything, more than happy to look into it myself. But I wanted to put my own spin on it because there's no spin to be had on this painting. It's a interesting and honestly very, beautiful in a kind of haunting way painting, yet no conversation on it. So I'll start the conversation here. Now, The Birth of Fascism is an interesting painting because there's no, marching soldiers. There's no, killing per se. There's just a woman, a fat, kind of distressed looking woman, laying down on a raft about the size of a bed, holding up a post that basically is waving a white flag. Now, there's a lot of things to be read there. I personally think, to simplify it, that represents the weak and inept, established governments, the status quo governments. The ocean around her is a crazy torrent moving throughout most of the painting, a rough waves lifting and pushing the raft around. And in the ocean, there is a not so very quiet swastika. Now, it's very large in the painting on the left corner, and it obviously is basically telling you, yes, the ocean, the crazy turbulent waters, is fascism that's going to take over the status quo, and the status quo is waving its white flag, willingly giving up. Now, that's part of the story, but what is the rest of the painting? There is clouds, there are hills, and there's a weird kind of fortress-looking thing in the right corner of the painting, and this is where I started to think about it. Now, the painter of this was a communist that fought in the Mexican Revolution. Now, this is just me spitballing, but I think in the right corner, that fortress, that building, represents the Soviet Union. It represents communism being kept at bay, being kept in a far corner of the world, really unable to spread. Because for a lot of communists, this painting was made in 1936, they probably felt a lot of disillusionment because communism had popped up in different governments. They took over in Hungary, they took over in southern Germany, only to be ousted. There were Marxist or worker revolts all the time, but then there would be like the Red Scare in the United States in the 1920s, or other movements that were formed to take down communists. So it always seemed the status quo was able to quell communism. But for a lot of people in 1936, I think especially a lot of communists or Marxist-thinking individuals, they felt like the status quo, depending on the nation they were in, were more than willing to settle with fascism. And I think that this is where the whole, if you talk to modern-day leftists, come from, the idea that they associate the status quo with fascism, because they realize at a certain point that the status quo, depending on the group, but most of the time, because if they live in a Western government or civilization, will prefer the fascist group over the communist group. And that communism, though appealing to some intellectuals and some people in government and some people here and there, will almost always be repressed and kept away, kept at bay. It will have to live in corners of the earth and be separated. which basically is what was happening to the Soviet Union at the time. Soviet Union was separated. It sent spies. It sent people all over the world. But at the end of the day, they didn't really have other fellow communist governments to help them out or protect them, or even just, fellow friendly governments that wanted to trade too much, because there were embargoes and there were just ideas of not interacting with the communists, which fair enough. There was an ideological, difference that was probably too far to bridge. Like this ocean. Maybe the ocean also represents that at the end of the day, the ideological bridge between the land where the fortress is and where the status quo government is, which is the raft, was too far. And the oceans of that represent fascism were too strong, too much of a current to prevent this. Now, what am I trying to get at? I think this is a sorrowful painting, not because they see fascism taking over, but because they wanted communism to take over. They feel upset that the energy that fascism represents, the futurism, the just raw like nationalism, the ability to appeal to many common people, was something that communism tried to put forward that it had. But it always seems that fascism was able to get the status quo of the government, get to at least, if it was a fight between a communist and a fascist, the government would probably bend to the fascists and choose that side. And it seems like that's what this painting is portraying, that the status quo will give up to fascism, and, slowly the fascists will take over, and the communists will be left in their corner of the world, isolated and alone. And I think this also speaks to a simple thing that the libertarians and communists both have in common, is they talk a lot about deep, very complex ideas about, people's freedoms or liberties or their rights. But they forget that fascism, or at least nationalism, or at least other simpler concepts, matter more to the common person. That blood and soil, that God and country, that, so on and so forth. These little slogans matter more to the common man. And I think this painting is despairingly admitting that, for the most part, communism might be left in a corner of maybe the world and may never be able to truly spread. Now, again, this was made in 1936, so obviously tons of things changed even before this guy died in the, I believe, 70s or 80s. But it still remains to be a fair point that some of these ideologies, especially communism, may have people here and there that respect it, intellectuals of certain spheres, certain government people, maybe even some common men. But a lot of people are more attracted to simple things of country and blood and religion and king and whatever else. So I would say this painting is the status quo not only waving the white flag, but spreading her legs, willing to accept fascism, to tip over her raft and take over the governments of the world, while the communists, though protected, though insulated, are utterly isolated from all else, and will be basically sitting as the world changes around them, unable to make the change that they want to. I hope this starts a conversation. I hope somebody reads into this painting and maybe comes up with a much more interesting concept of what it's really about. But this is my take on the painting, and I hope you guys have a nice day, and God bless.